Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Good morning, I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Here are the stories we're following today.
Karen, we begin with a Bloomberg News exclusive. The U.S. is considering capping sales of advanced artificial intelligence chips from Nvidia and other American companies to specific countries. Sources say officials in the Biden administration are considering the move in a bid to limit some nations' AI capabilities. Bloomberg's Annabelle Druller says the focus of the restrictions is on the Middle East.
This is a region we know that's looking to invest very heavily into AI data centers in particular. They've got companies that are wanting to establish there or build up their data center presence, and they've also got very deep pockets to fund them. The Middle East, we know it's a place that has a growing relationship with China, which is what these sorts of caps were initially put in place for, was to restrict China's high-tech ambition. So there is a concern that if you allow companies like Nvidia, AMD to export to third-party countries, those chips could still make their way to places, particularly to China.
Bloomberg's Annabelle Druller says the deliberations are in their early stages. Now, the news of this possible overseas sales cap broke just hours after Nvidia's share price hit its first record close since June. This morning, Nvidia shares are down more than 1% in early trading.
Well, Nathan, we're also following bank shares this morning as we get earnings from the financial industry, and we get a preview from Bloomberg. Sonali Basak.
We're awaiting third quarter earnings from Bank of America, Citigroup, and Goldman Sachs. And remember, it's the first earnings report since the Federal Reserve started its interest rate cutting cycle. What we know from JP Morgan is that eventually net interest income is going to be under pressure, and we'll be wondering if that's the same for Bank of America. And same goes for Citigroup, where there's a very large credit card business. For Goldman Sachs, we'll be watching investment banking and trading results because we know that the most recent quarter was a volatile one. And more than anything, we'll be watching for the outlook for the rest of the year because volatility is expected to remain somewhat elevated. And the question is, can trading and banking fees be high on that backdrop? In New York, I'm Sonali Basak for Bloomberg Radio.
Okay, Sonali, thank you. Turning to the economy now, more Fed officials are speaking out about the future of monetary policy. Minneapolis Fed President Neel Kashkari says it appears likely that further modest reductions in interest rates will be appropriate in coming quarters. Kashkari also talked about the fight against inflation in Buenos Aires at a conference held by the Central Bank of Argentina.
So 2% is our inflation target. Depending on your measure of inflation, it went up to 7, 8, 9%. And it is now running, I would call it at around, by our primary measure, it's now running at around a 2.5% run rate. And a lot of evidence suggesting that it's going to continue to fall from here.
Minneapolis Fed Chief Neel Kashkari has said previously he was comfortable with the Fed's 50 basis point rate cut in September and that a quarter-point reduction at each of the Fed's two remaining meetings this year is a reasonable starting point.
Well, Nathan, we turn now to new developments in the Middle East. And Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has reportedly told the U.S. he will strike Iranian military sites. And Bloomberg's Ed Baxter has the story.
The way Netanyahu puts it is that he is willing to strike military rather than oil or nuclear targets. The Biden administration has been very open about the fact that it did not want the strikes on oil or nuclear. The Washington Post reports on the Netanyahu-Biden call earlier this week, the prime minister had said he was going to strike infrastructure, so there was fear it could be what the U.S. did not want. After that call, the president also announced the sending of the THAAD system to Israel. Ed Baxter, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Ed, thank you. And oil is sinking on that Washington Post report. Checking NYMEX crude right now, it's down 4 2/3% at $70.39 per barrel. Brent is lower by 4.5% at $73.97. Meanwhile, the International Energy Agency says geopolitical risks to oil output in the Middle East and elsewhere are being offset by plentiful global supplies.
Now let's get the latest from the campaign trail, Nathan. And both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump were on opposite ends of Pennsylvania, pitching dueling economic plans. The vice president touted her proposal for a $50,000 small business tax deduction. At a rally in Erie, she played clips from the former president's events to paint him as an extremist.
He's talking about the enemy within our country, Pennsylvania. He's talking about that he considers anyone who doesn't support him or who will not bend to his will an enemy of our country.
Meanwhile, Donald Trump held a town hall in Oaks, Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia, but the economic discussion quickly fell off the rails when audience members started fainting inside the sweltering arena. So Trump decided to turn it into a dance party.
Let's not do any more questions. Let's just listen to music. Let's make it into a music. Who the hell wants to hear questions, right?
Before the interruption, Trump touted his plans to eliminate Social Security income taxes and to deregulate energy and home construction.
And Karen, the campaign continues today. Vice President Harris will be in Detroit for a town hall with radio host Charlamagne the God as she ramps up her efforts to court black voters. Former President Trump will be at the Economic Club of Chicago for an exclusive interview with Bloomberg News editor-in-chief John Micklethwait. That conversation will begin at noon Wall Street time. Our coverage begins at 11:30. On a special edition of Bloomberg's Balance of Power. You can listen on Bloomberg Radio or watch on Bloomberg Television or on the Bloomberg Podcasts YouTube channel.
Well, Nathan, there's new developments this morning in the one-month strike at Boeing, and we get the very latest with Bloomberg's John Tucker. And, John, it looks like things are getting more tense.
Karen, Boeing says it's going to be laying off 17,000 employees amid its ongoing workers' strike. Now the head of the Labor Department reaching out to both sides to try to fix things with no end in sight for the now month-long machinist strike at Boeing. The acting Labor Secretary, Julie Su, traveled to Seattle to meet with Boeing and the workers' union. The two sides cut off talks last week. Strikers really aren't sure what to expect.
I think they're playing a game. It's a cat and mouse game. Who's going to bite first?
Well, Boeing also announced a delay to its 777X program, angering big customers like Emirates. The intention to cut jobs comes as the plane maker seeks to stave off warnings of a possible ratings downgrade from S&P Global. In New York, I'm John Tucker, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, John, thank you. It's time now for a look at some of the other stories making news in New York and around the world. And for that, we're joined by Bloomberg's Michael Barr. Michael, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. Officials say federal disaster workers paused and then changed some of their hurricane recovery efforts in North Carolina, including abandoning door-to-door visits after receiving threats during a wave of misinformation. The Rutherford County Sheriff's Office said it received a call about a man with an assault rifle who commented about possibly harming FEMA employees and targeting a militia against them. Former FEMA Administrator Pete Gaynor.
We have the best mission in the federal government, helping people before, during, and after disaster. I think we have some of the most dedicated employees that are trying to do that for their fellow Americans. And stuff like this, it's not good for morale for anyone on the team.
Former FEMA Administrator Pete Gaynor. The man was later arrested and charged with a misdemeanor. Several jurors have just been seated in the years-old case of the murders of two young girls who were hiking in Delphi, Indiana. Investigators say that prison recordings show the suspect, Richard Allen, confessed more than 60 times while behind bars. It took nearly 6 years for an arrest. Police linking a bullet from the crime scene to Allen's gun in the killings of 13-year-old Abby Williams and 14-year-old Libby German. Libby's sister, Kelsey.
I had so much faith that our detectives would keep working on this until they got our answers and justice for the girls, and until the conviction is here, I'll still remain that way too.
Evidence from Libby's own phone is expected to play a critical role at trial. Another federal civil rights violation trial gets underway today in Louisville for former police officer Brett Hankinson. He shot and killed Breonna Taylor in 2020 during what was allegedly a botched raid where Taylor's boyfriend fired at police. Former federal prosecutor Lori Levinson.
This is a case of a federal civil rights violation, but it really is the question of whether an officer used too much force. And don't forget that Hankinson fired 10 shots into Taylor's apartment through a glass door that night.
Former federal prosecutor Lori Levinson. In a symbolic display of anger, North Korea blew up the northern section of unused roads that once linked it with the South. Today's action comes as the rivals have been exchanging threats days after the North claimed that its rival flew drones over its capital, Pyongyang. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg. Karen.
All right, Michael Barr, thank you. Time Time now for the Bloomberg Sports Update, brought to you by Tri-State Audi. Here's John's Stash Hour. John, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. Moving closer to a Subway Series. Up first with the Mets in Los Angeles. Dodgers had thrown 33 consecutive scoreless innings. That ended quickly. Francisco Lindor hit a leadoff home run. An inning later, the Dodgers walked Lindor intentionally to load the bases.
But here's the payoff pitch. Swing on a drive in the air, pretty well hit right center. Pages back at the track, near the wall. It is gone! A grand slam for Mark Vientos on a 3-2 pitch. He clears the bases, hitting it into the pavilion in right center field.
On WHSQ, Mets led 6-0, survived the sixth inning when L.A. scored twice, had 3 on, but hit it into an inning-ending double play. Mets won 7-3, come back to New York with the NLCS tied at 1, Game 3 tomorrow. Then it was the Yankees in the ALCS opener with Cleveland. Juan Soto homered third inning. Yankees got 2 more on 3 Guardian walks and 2 wild pitches. And then in the 7th, up stepped the hottest Yank.
Now the 0-1 is hit in the air to left center. It is high. It is far. Oh, it is gone. A Stantonian home run.
WFAN, Giancarlo Stanton coming off the big ALDS. Yanks won 5-2. Carlos Rodon, 6 strong innings, and Luke Weaver flourishing as the Yankee closer. He got the last 5 outs, 4 by strikeout. Game 2 tonight. A game at MetLife for the second straight night, and just like the Giants, a loss for the Jets. Buffalo won 23-20. Josh Allen threw for 2 touchdowns, ran for another. Aaron Rodgers threw for 2, including a Hail Mary to close out the first half. But just like last Sunday in London, a late, costly Rodgers interception. It spoils the coaching debut of Jeff Ulbrich. At the Garden, Rangers beat Detroit 4-1. In Newark, Devils over Utah 3-0. In Denver, Islanders down Colorado 6-2. Florida topped the Bruins 4-3. John Stash Hour, Bloomberg Sports.
Coast to coast on Bloomberg Radio, nationwide on Sirius XM, and around the world on Bloomberg.com and the Bloomberg Business app. This is Bloomberg Daybreak.
Good morning. I'm Nathan Hager. The breakneck growth of artificial intelligence technology may face new limits on a country-by-country basis. Bloomberg News has learned the Biden administration is considering sales caps on chips from the likes of Nvidia and Advanced Micro Devices in the interest of national security. For more on this, we're joined by Bloomberg Radio and television anchor Kriti Gupta. Kriti, good morning. What more are we hearing about what the administration's considering here?
Well, good morning, Nathan. Usually when we hear about the Biden administration being tough on those chip exports, it's usually in relation to whether or not that very secure technology can end up in China. This time around, though, it looks like they're considering how it might end up in the Middle East. Now, there were suspicions of this earlier this year that this may be an area of concern, especially as the Middle East has really been ramping up their chip making capacity. So you've seen TSMC, for example, show interest in places like the UAE. The concern here, though, is that if you now have to consider China for national security reasons, do you have to consider exports to the Middle East for that as well? That being said, this is certainly on the table, but no decisions have been made just yet. And even if they were made, it's unclear if they would be imposed during the remainder of President Biden's term.
So if this is in the interest of fairness, is this the kind of thing that Middle Eastern allies could work with either the Biden administration or whatever administration might consider these kinds of limitations?
Well, that's the expectation. Look, there's a global race, as we know, to get our hands on this kind of chip technology, whereas AI may be rising very quickly and spearheaded by Nvidia chips, for example, or EV technology spearheaded over in China. There are still other parts of the world that are actively trying to play catch up in a lot of ways. In the absence of being able to do that, or in the process of developing their own technology and their own supply chains, this is where there is a real incentive to be negotiating with the Biden administration. And it looks like that may be where this is headed. But a big piece of leverage here that the Biden administration and the United States broadly has over the Middle East is that in controlling those exports, being able to say, maybe you also need to lessen your dependence or lessen your relationship with China in some way. We've already seen evidence of that show up in the way that the U.S. has talked about export controls with the Netherlands, of course, the home country of ASML, the major chip equipment maker for most of the chip equipment making technology in the world. And that puts the Dutch government, for example, in a pretty tight spot.
Well, what could these kinds of country-by-country, national security-focused export limitations mean for the AI trade overall? I mean, we just saw Nvidia hit its first record since June yesterday. Does that put the AI frenzy in a little bit of doubt this morning?
One would think, but it's not really making a dent. And the reason for that is because it's not, one, imposed. Two, we don't know what the actual details of this move would actually look like. And three, at the end of the day, it's not actually hitting the supply just yet, or the expected supply of these chips. There is still a little bit of a bottleneck on that, where Nvidia is kind of the only player in the game at the moment, as recently shown by the fact that AMD, Advanced Micro Devices, has also released their own kind of competitor chip and met with not such great investor appetite, because the concern was, one, can you ramp up capacity, and two, can you monetize it? So again, it still feels like Nvidia's dominance is here to stay for now.
Got about 30 seconds left, but the market focus is going to turn very quickly back to banks. What to expect from the earnings this morning?
Well, there are two things. One is, do we see the net interest income outperformance of JP Morgan and Wells Fargo show up in the likes of Citi, Goldman Sachs, and I believe Morgan Stanley reporting tomorrow as well, among some of the other banks? The second, especially for Citi, is going to be that credit card data. If there's any hiccups in the JP Morgan numbers, it's that there might have been a little bit of slowdown in that spend. We'll see if Citi shows the same thing.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak, your morning podcast on the stories making news from Wall Street to Washington and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed by 6 a.m. Eastern each morning on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen.
You can also listen live each morning starting at 5 a.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg 1130 in New York, Bloomberg 99.1 in Washington, Bloomberg 92.9 in Boston, and nationwide on Sirius XM Channel 121.
Plus, listen coast to coast on the Bloomberg Business app, now with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto interfaces.
And don't forget to subscribe to Bloomberg News Now. It's the latest news whenever you want it, in 5 minutes or less. Search Bloomberg News Now on your favorite podcast platform to stay informed all day long. I'm Karen Moscow.
And I'm Nathan Hager. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak.